Okay, so I'll start. So everyone, welcome to our second webinar in our series on edible landscaping. Michael's going to take it from here. If there are any questions, you can put them in the chat, and we'll manage the chat questions from my screen. So Michael takes some breaks during the presentation and at the end to answer any questions. But if you have something that you need clarified, I'm happy to jump in and clarify or ask Michael to. Okay?
All right, great. Well, thanks everybody for joining. This is an easy presentation for me to give because I'm absolutely crazy about all things mushrooms. And tonight we're going to cover a lot, but we're also going to focus on some real basics, how to be growing mushrooms in the outdoor landscape. So largely that's on logs and wood chips. Now, there's obviously a whole universe of ways to grow mushrooms. A lot of what we're used to eating are grown on sterilized sawdust blocks and usually metal warehouses. And that goes for your shiitakes, your oysters. And, you know, they kind of taste like it, especially when you compare that to the ones that you can grow outside, which is absolutely exquisite. And one of the main reasons, you know, to be working with fungi. So I got a whole basket of beauties here on the screen. And that bottom front, that is actually a golden oyster, which I've found to be very easy to grow. That's another oyster next to, I think that's blue oyster on the right of the yellow. And then we've got lion's manes, which is an amazing tasting mushroom, good for the brain. A couple of shiitakes in the middle there. That big mushroom in sort of the top center there is a wine cap, and we are definitely going to be talking about growing wine cap tonight. We're going to focus on our shiitakes, oysters, and wine caps because they are the easiest to grow. So without further ado, this is my first book, Edible Landscaping, the Permaculture Twist, and I'm partly sharing this because I have a chapter dedicated in this book to what I'm going to be covering tonight. So if you miss any bits and bobs, all the notes are in there. It's very how-to, very straightforward. This is my most recent endeavor, for the love of pawpaws. Unfortunately, not gonna, well, I'll probably find a way to talk about pawpaws tonight somehow, but largely for the next webinar. Okay, and I live in this beautiful circular straw bale home, which we built here in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains near Frederick, Maryland. And we grow lots of mushrooms here, and we do a lot of hands-on workshops here, which you'll see some shots of as well. Okay, so those little people standing on the top of that mile-high pile of wood would be us if it were not for mushrooms, for fungi. Now, that's because fungi are the first ones on the scene when woody material begins to die. They begin the process of breaking down woody material and beginning to make soil so that we can grow food and live on this planet. A lot of people don't realize that mushrooms, fungi, are what are known as a keystone species. So it's an ecological term, meaning that that species is paramount to most all other in their ecological niche. So we really rely on fungi. And truly in the past, during extinctions, and mind you, we're in one right now, those species that paired with fungi were the ones that made it through. So something to remember there. Okay. All right, let's bring it down to earth here. And there are a number of basic ecological groups of fungi. I'm just going to mention three here. So mycorrhizal, so myco, and rhizal, meaning root. These are the networks of fungi. So when I say fungi, it is interchangeable with the term mycelium. And these are what you see in a healthy forest system. When you kick the leaf litter aside, you'll see all these white webs connecting. Those are the fungi or the mycelium. And basically they're single-celled, organisms that thread together. And like an internet, they just link and they spread. And in a healthy forest system, what they're doing is they're attaching to the roots, and they are exchanging sugars and nutrients with the plants and the trees, and it's very symbiotic. Now, this category does not have many of the edible mushrooms that we enjoy, but the most popular one in this group would be the truffle. All right. Then the second group, I don't care much for this name, but it's parasitic, and these are the fungi that are growing on living trees. Now, Mother Nature has its own wisdom, and there's a lot more at play why these mushrooms are growing on living trees. But as humans, we're calling them parasitic. But one of the interesting things that we're finding out is that some of the most medicinal mushrooms for human health are actually some in this category. Now, these are ones that are growing on living trees. And the last category, the saprophytic fungi. These are also known as the wood munchers. This is where most of our edible and many of our medicinal fungi come from. And these guys eat dead woody material, lignin, cellulose. So when you see a tree in the wood and it's died and it's got mushrooms popping out on it, those are saprophytic fungi beginning to break that material down. They basically are excreting like enzymes, and they're breaking down that woody lignin material, slowly becoming soil, right? So this is the group that typically we are getting most of our mushrooms from. So lion's manes, the aforementioned shiitake, reishi, and of course oysters, all fall into this category. All right. So how do we do this? Now, when we're looking to grow mushrooms on logs, we are wanting healthy wood, right? So you're not going to go and grab a piece of wood that's been out on the firewood pile for a year, right? That already has ambient fungi. So there's spores in the air. Typically when temperatures get over 50 degrees, spores are all over the place. They're on our clothes, we're carrying them around. And that means they're landing on wood and beginning to colonize it, right? And grow themselves out. So when we want to be growing mushrooms of a certain type for ourselves, we want to select wood that does not already have any other kind of fungi in it. That means that we want healthy wood, right? So this can be a way also to go into a forest that's been cut probably many times and has regenerated in very thick clusters. So a bit of a forest management system includes going in and thinning certain species so that others have more space and they can create the overstory canopy and create that long-term succession. So there's actually a way that we can approach growing mushrooms that can also benefit the succession of the forests around us. So we're not necessarily going out and cutting down the forest to grow mushrooms. We're working with the current systems. And so that could look like going in and thinning out, hard maples, young oak trees. And we're looking for a diameter typically of 4 to 6, 4 to 8 inches. They can be larger, but it becomes harder to manage. So we're looking for a diameter of 4 to 8 inches by approximately 36 inches or 3 feet long. Right? Again, approximate, doesn't have to be perfect. You do want to be careful not to go much below 4 inches because you're going to lose the moisture holding capability of the log. And I'll talk about that again later, because if it's one thing you remember about this webinar and mushrooms is moisture, 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 right? More about that. that's a key element, because remember I mentioned that fungi are only one cell wall thin. That means that if they dry out, they die very quickly. So we want to maintain that moisture. So I typically look to get my wood cut at the end of winter. So for us in Maryland, we're zone 6B, 7. It's typically toward the end of February that I will start looking for that mushroom wood. Now, it's dormant, and that's important. So when trees wake up and the sap starts to flow, right? You can cut mushroom logs when trees are in active growth. It's less than ideal, and part of that is because the bark will more easily come off. And the bark is the log's protection in holding moisture, right? So if the bark's coming off quickly, your log's going to dry out and your fungi are going to be less likely to survive. So dormant wood is ideal. That bark sticking close is important. Now, a lot of times wood will come down during the winter months. So let's say it's November and there's an early ice storm and some really healthy branches of an oak come down in your neighborhood. Well, that's good stuff. It's healthy wood and it's branch wood. So branch wood I will throw in there is extra preferred by the fungi. So it's also called ramial wood. And if you can imagine that a trunk of a tree, especially a mature tree, has a hard heartwood in it, and then it's got, you know, some of that sapwood on the outside, that sort of that white, more white light colored. So that sapwood is like, it's like bimbo white bread, right? For the fungi, it's easy to eat, you know, sugars and cellulose. It's just fast consumption and they love it. So the same with branch wood. Typically your branch wood is going to have a lot more of that sapwood in it. So you don't have to necessarily just look for that, but I'm telling you, that is the extra special juicy stuff for fungi. So if branch wood comes down, that's great. If someone's thinning trees or, you know, branches for power lines or their house, grab some of that wood. And if it's dormant, that's fine. It can stay outside because there's not going to be ambient fungi falling on it. Not during the winter, not when the temperatures are cool, fungi go dormant. And so then that wood could then be used in the next, you know, early spring. But again, when I'm out looking for wood, if I don't already have it, I'm looking in late February. I go and I either get branch wood or I thin out trees in the forest, or I will call up people that cut firewood. And so you don't have to have a chainsaw, you don't have to have woods to do this. You can look at your local firewood providers and call them up and say, hey, I'm looking for, you know, certain types of woods. We'll talk about that in a minute. And, you know, at a certain diameter from healthy trees, and I'll pay you $5 a piece. And they're going to be like, wow, this person's crazy. All right, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I'll get you 20 logs at $5 a piece. So you can actually work out having these logs sort of, you know, delivered to you if you do a little bit of creative legwork, so to say. So I get my wood late February. I let it sit for 2 to 4 weeks, ideally kind of in a shaded spot or not exposed to dry winds. And this allows the wood's natural antifungal properties to diminish. So a tree, while alive, has within its chemistry antifungal properties so that it's not getting eaten all the time. So when the wood is cut, ideally it has little that has time, that chemistry to shift and change so that when you're putting in your fungi, it has less competition. Now this is a contended point. Plenty of people have cut their mushroom logs, you know, gone ahead, inoculated them, and had pretty good success. But to err on the side, let's go ahead and say let's wait a couple of weeks, right? But cut that wood dormant before that sap flow starts. That's important. The one time you really do not want to cut mushroom wood is at early sap rise, when leaves are just starting to come out and things are getting going. You want to wait. You don't want to cut then. You might wait at least another month until, you know, more summer is starting. And then if you're eager and you're going to cut, go ahead. You can still use summer wood. You're likely to have less productivity from your logs. And again, your bark could fall off early, but it's doable. Okay. So cut the wood, let it sit. Now, fresh cut wood has the perfect amount of moisture in it. If you've had wood from November that you've been holding on to, you're going to want to dunk that wood in some cool water, something that's not chlorinated, overnight. Let's say 12, 18, 20 hours. And you're going to sort of rehydrate that log before you begin to inoculate it. So you've either cut your wood at the end of winter, you're waiting approximately a month. So for us, I'm cutting at the end of February, usually early April. I'm looking at starting to inoculate my logs. Daytime temperatures are starting to come up to around 50 degrees. That's perfect. Now you can also do log inoculation in the fall when trees have gone dormant, but then you've got to do a little more protective measures around keeping your logs at a certain temperature. And some professionals will do that. They'll put them in a hoop house and they'll cover them with blankets that filter water through. And so it is possible to start this process, during the winter if you can protect your logs. I'm not going to go into that detail this time. Really going to focus on this seasonal spring startup. Okay, so these little wooden birch dowels are covered in fungi. They're covered in mycelium. And the term that we use for this is spawn. So spawn in mushroom lingo means usually a woody substrate that has the fungi growing on it. Sometimes you'll also see grains and other sort of cellulose-rich material that the fungi can start on. So you can think of this as like kindling, right? So the fungi, again, they're going to quickly inoculate something like this. And then what you do is you would either purchase this spawn from a mushroom purveyor, someone like Field and Forest. I've got, can you see this? Thumbs up if you can see this. So this is Field and Forest products. They're out of, let's see, Wisconsin. I like these guys. I've worked with them for at least a decade. They've always had high quality mushroom spawn and materials. Really, they're a one-stop shop for getting all the materials you need, except for your wood, to starting your own mushroom growing. And their catalog and their website have a lot of good beginner how-to information. So I recommend researching them. Even if you don't buy from them, you can get a lot more understanding about the process and the bits and bobs you need to do it. And you'd be surprised that it's not very expensive. So you can get a bag of shiitake spawn, let's say 1,000 count. For probably like $35, $40. And each log average probably about 30 plugs. So you can imagine you're getting, I don't know what, 30, 40 logs out of a $40 bag. That's pretty good. So I highly recommend these guys. They're good people as well. They do not sponsor me, though they should. I talk them up so much. All right, so the process. Good beer helps a lot.
But not near a power tool.
Not near power tools, I know. So drink, drill your logs, then drink your beer, all right? So the process.
Clarify question.
Yeah.
When you said dunking the logs,
Mm-hmm.
Can we just hose them down and let the water soak in?
I would, if they've been sitting for months, I would dunk them. You're not necessarily going to get the, ideal absorption by just wetting them down.
Okay.
If you have a creek, a pond, get some sort of trough or put a bucket, dunk one half, flip it around, dunk the other end, make something work. It's important. Really, the most common failure for growing your own mushrooms is the logs drying out. And that can be starting dry or placing them in the wrong spot, which we're going to spend some time talking about. So really, moisture is very key to this. Okay, so we have our logs. Now what we're going to do is we're going to drill the logs so that we can insert our spawn. And typical spawn comes in those plugs, those little wooden dowels or sawdust. I like the little wooden dowels. They're kind of fun. It's like whack-a-mole. You can punch them into the log, being careful of the bark, of course. So you can use a regular wood drill bit. I believe it's 5/16 that you would use for the little wooden dowels, or Field and Forest sell these really cool little mushroom ninja drill bits that have a collar, the right depth, and they're awesome. They're like 15 or 20 bucks. They're definitely worth it if you're going to do a number of logs. Otherwise, get a wood bit, maybe put a little bit of tape on it, try to get your depth right. That's important. Okay, a little excerpt out of my book. So really, this is an approximation. You don't need your tape measure when you're out there. Pick any spot on the log, come down 2 inches, and start drilling it approximately every 6 inches going down your log. Rotate your log over. I have 2 inches on here. I typically go further, but it's fine if you do more, if you drill more. And then you're just going to offset between those ones you just did so that ultimately you're going all the way around the log, and it kind of creates a diamond pattern. Again, it's approximation. This is all somewhat overkill. You're really extra inserting your fungi into the log by doing this. Like I say, 30 is probably an average. Over the years, I've put less spawn in because I realize if my conditions are right, I don't need so much. But more the merrier if you're not doing a whole lot and you've got plenty of spawn. And there it is going in. Now you'll read a lot of times it's recommended to use a rubber mallet to put these in. And that's because they're trying to help you not mash or mar the bark. Because again, that bark is your protective layer for holding in moisture. But I don't find them to work very well, especially with these dowels. So I'll use a hammer, but I'll be very careful. I won't like mash it in and hurt the bark. I'll just tap it in just right. So let me go back one. So after you're inserting in your spawn, what happens, all conditions being good, that fungi is going to jump off of the spawn and into your log. It's now jumping into all of that lovely, woody mass, and it's going to start running through the log. And we call this the spawn run. And this typically takes a year. Do not be surprised, in some conditions and temperatures, it could take 18 months. The quickest I've seen with some of the oyster species is 6 or 7 months you can start to get some mushrooms. But know that this is something you're doing. You're doing it one time, you're inoculating, you get a successful spawn run, average of a year, then you leave your log outside, it's going to fruit for you naturally without doing anything more for it. Right? So it's kind of a one-time doing, put it in the right spot, and you will receive lots of mushrooms. It's really one of the easiest foods to grow. They're very abundant. It's one of the reasons I'm so excited about them. In permaculture, we really kind of, look for the natural flow of abundance so that we're not working too hard unnecessarily. And fungi in the right environments, in the Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, this is ideal fungi environments. So we don't have to do a whole lot to get a lot back. Okay, so they're perennial, and it really depends on the size of the log, the type of wood the log is, how long these logs will last. So let's take a poplar log, a tulip poplar, which is a hardwood but quite soft, and we're doing oyster on it. And let's say it's only 6 inches in diameter. It will, at year 1, start fruiting pretty strong. And the next year, probably pretty decent. But then by year 3, that bark's probably starting to fall off and you'll start to get a few mushrooms. And by year 4, it might be totally done. Whereas if you had an oak log, let's say you had an 8-inch oak log with shiitake in it, it might take at least a full year to start flushing mushrooms. And it might be a small amount. There's kind of a bell curve with mushrooms on logs where you'll start to get, the first couple of years building up, and then you'll kind of get a pinnacle, and then it'll start to come down in production again. But An oak log that's 8 inches, 6 to 8 inches thick, you might get 6, 7, potentially 8 years of mushrooms out of that. So it's variable, but your time input is minimal for what you get out. And I would say on an average, not doing anything extra to your logs, you might be looking at getting, a half a pound a year off of your logs, potentially upwards of 5 pounds over its whole life. And we're talking about mushrooms here. They don't weigh much. So that's actually quite a lot of mushrooms. And that's just one log. Okay. So one of the last steps to the process.
Question about drilling.
Okay.
Drill before dunking?
Now you'd want to dunk them if you needed to dunk them. So it's only if you've got wood that's been sitting out all winter.
Okay.
I would dunk definitely first, let them that, and then you're going to drill and continue. And you don't need to dunk if your wood has been cut recently. So the last stage, second to last stage really, is waxing over your spawn holes. And you can use paraffin wax, beeswax. You want to use a wax though that gets really hot. I don't think candle wax is really going to cut it because you want it to really seal in and hold on to your log. Excuse me. Now, a couple of the reasons that you're doing this is fungi. Hold on. Might have some of those spores in my throat. All right. So you're sealing this because fungi is food. It's food to bees. It's food to all kinds of insects. It's a wonderful, again, keystone for many species. So you want to seal that in. You're also sealing in the moisture. You don't want that spawn to dry out. So you're sealing it in, keeping it from being eaten. In drier climates, a lot of times people will wax the entire end of the log. And I find, excuse me, in our humid climates that's really unnecessary. But hey, if you just got a few logs and you got extra wax, it does not hurt to go ahead and seal the ends of your logs too. It's just extra moisture retention. And that might protect you a little bit from potentially not having it in the most ideal spot. And that also goes if there was a branch cut off the side of the log and you've got an exposed, piece of, log, go ahead and seal that as well with wax. Be generous with your wax. I do a camp stove with an old fondue pot. It works great. You got to be careful it doesn't get too hot and smoke and catch on fire. But you do want it to be quite hot because if it does not seal properly, a couple of days later, it'll fall off, right? And I've also learned that if you're going to dunk your log or if it's raining, let the outer bark of your log dry before you wax it. I have learned that trying to wax on a wet log, you don't get as good a seal either. Now, a lot of people will do a double boiler system where they put a pot, put some water in it, put another pot in it, and they melt their wax that way. Whatever works for you. Then the last step is to go ahead and label. So even with your best intentions of thinking you're going to remember what you did, good to go ahead. So this says double jewel. That's a type of shiitake. And then I'll also usually put the month and the year on it. And this is very helpful, especially when you start to grow different types of mushrooms or even different strains of mushrooms. And if you've never grown these, it also gives you an added element of security in the sense that when it starts to flush mushrooms, you can say, okay, is this what it's supposed to be? And you have the name, you can go ahead, you can Google it, you get a picture, or if it's from Field and Forest, you can take their catalog and take the picture out there and you look at the mushroom and say, okay, yes, that's a double jewel shiitake. That looks just like it, you're good to go. Now here's my disclaimer. You don't just eat any mushroom that pops out of your log, because if some step has not been followed properly, another ambient fungi could move in and you could have a different colonization. And if you start getting some weird orange looking mushrooms popping out, don't eat them. So the tagging helps you, to be sure, double check it when it does fruit if you're not certain. Once you start doing this, it's very obvious. Shiitakes and oysters, just very obvious to ID. Okay, so we've tagged them. Yes.
how often do you get these ambient mushrooms, like that are not the ones that are on the log?
Well, it's really about, I don't get them because I got my timing right. I've got my healthy wood. It's got the right moisture. I've got good quality spawn. I've got them in the right spot for moisture. And you do all those things right, you're going to have success because you've really heavily inoculated your log with a very strong fungi. So, but if I didn't do one of those steps correctly, and then it's very possible if my fungi doesn't get established in it, some other fungi most certainly will, right? So, I mean, I guess it could be common for beginners, let's say, and really, again, you need the quality of the materials, and then where you put it is important. And we're going to talk about that next.
Okay, wait, there's a question from Jessica who is asking if your wax is falling off, is it because it isn't hot enough, or
Probably because it's not hot enough. If you're using paraffin wax or a high heating wax, it's probably not hot enough. I can tell by the smoke, how much it's smoking. I mean, you really want it to be quite hot. You're getting close to the flash point. It's kind of a sweet spot there. I have had my fondue pot catch on fire a couple of times, but that's usually when I'm not paying attention. So yeah, when the smoke gets really thick, then you might want to keep an eye on turning it down. But you do want it to be quite hot. You want a strong seal. And again, if you have a super humid environment and it's not as important. The wax is not as important. I have had logs that I did not wax and they still fruited. I'll show you a picture in a minute of one such case. We're very humid here in the Maryland Mid-Atlantic area. So here is one place for placing logs. So when logs are going through their spawn run, they like to be very close to the ground. And here you can see I've got them just raised up, a few inches. That could be on a brick, could be on, another piece of wood. And you want just a little bit of airflow, around them. Because remember, if they're exposed to air and wind, that can dry your logs out as well. And you want to put them where water can fall on them, yet they're in the shade. So I've gone through some different spots learning this. So when I first started, I was like, oh, well, I'm going to put them under these evergreens. And I had these 3 really tightly planted large spruce evergreens. And I thought, well, this is perfect. It's perennial shade. It's out of the wind. So I started my mushroom logs. What I didn't take into consideration was actually quite dry under there because they were so thick that it was a dry, the tree was really holding a lot of that rain. So not a great spot. A lot of my logs dried out. Then I brought them and I put them under the porch, under the deck where water was falling through. Now we have, we have natural wood for our deck. So that's probably an important part. And I found actually that they got too moist there. And some of them were starting to get some, funky fungi and molds on them. And that's not good either. So, and now that's going to vary for everybody. Under your porch or your deck might be a great spot. Put them on the gravel. That's usually under a lot of decks can be good for that sort of drainage. Then they're probably going to be really happy. I didn't have that gravel under this one. That's part of the issue. So sometimes this is on the north side of a house where it stays in perpetual shade from the house, but it's not under the roof eaves, so that rain can fall on them. And that's a great spot because you also want to put these where you can see them, because when it comes time for them to fruit, they fruit very quickly and you want to be seeing those. I've had some folks take workshops and, say to me, yeah, my mushroom log never did anything. And I was like, well, where'd you put it? Oh, down at the back of the yard behind the bush. And I'm like, well, that's probably a great spot. It probably fruited. You just never saw it or knew it, right? So keeping them where you flow, where you move, where you can visually see them is helpful, especially once they're starting to want to fruit, because those things can fruit, they can show a little pinhead, and then by the end of the day, they could be ready to harvest. Usually they're ready to harvest within 24, 36 hours. So you want to be seeing that. Otherwise you miss it. Some other critter might get it. So put them behind a bush by your front door where it stays shady. That's fine. Make sure rain can fall on it. After the spawn run, after that year, when they're starting to fruit, they are more resilient. They don't need quite as much protection, and you can start to lean them up, especially when it comes time to cut them, for harvesting your mushrooms, because those mushrooms will push out anywhere on the log, not just where you have drilled. And if they're flat, they'll just squish out on the ground and just you'll kind of lose their quality. So leaning your logs up, especially in the fruiting time, which is typically the spring and the fall, you want to lean them up again in the shade where you can cut them. And I think aesthetically they're very interesting looking, and they're great conversation pieces. And I think having them in your landscape to look at is cool. But that's me. All right. I'm going to see if this video works. If it does, it's going to show you where I have found the sweet spot to be on our property for the mushrooms. So hopefully this will work, and I'll be back in a minute.
Here at Long Creek Homestead, Blue Ridge Mountains, Maryland. We call our place Long Creek because we have this beautiful long riparian zone, creek that runs through it, which makes it a perfect spot for growing mushrooms. Here you can see our shiitake logs that we drilled last year. These are oak logs with shiitake. This is Wide Range 46, which is a wonderful strain from Field and Forest. We're at late March here, so now that the weather is warming up to 50-degree days, we're starting to get some of our first flushes. These were drilled a year ago, so they're starting their first flush, so I'm leaning them up so we can harvest them. But these we just drilled, and we're keeping them low to the ground so that they can get their spawn run. That's that first year of the mycelium running through the log. So they're just barely off the ground here. You can see where they were waxed, drilled, waxed, and plugged. These are also shiitakes on oak. Now you can see they're in a deciduous forest area. This is actually spice bush in flower. We got overstory poplar trees. This is a really good environment. It's not windy. It's down here in a moist area by our creek. Here you can see more of our logs. Putting your logs in the right location is one of the key elements to having successfully fruiting mushroom logs. As you can see, we're all about the fungi here. These are some previous logs. Got some oysters on poplar there, some other shiitakes, and right down here by the creek. So perfect humidity levels. I'm going to throw this in as a bonus. This is a mulberry that was a volunteer here. I cut it back a few years ago, and it reshot these whips, which I grafted. So now each one of these whips is a different grafted mulberry type. Yeah, I like by the creek.
All right. Let's see if I can get out of here. Whoops. All right. So this is also a disclaimer. This can happen to you once you start growing mushrooms, because it's amazing how productive they can be. This log was left over from a workshop. It got completely drilled. It only got half of the spawn put into it, and we ran out of spawn, so it just got thrown on the ground in a nice shady spot, mind you. Never waxed it. And then like the next year when I walked by, there it was, completely fruited. So that's a genuine excited and surprised face from finding. And that's like that's a lot of mushrooms. You see, there's a lot of flush. So you do get a lot of mushrooms. So here's a little mushroom porn, and these are shiitakes flushing, leaned up in the shade so that you can go along and cut all the way around. After they flush, then it's probably good to bring them back closer down to the ground. A lot of people will Lincoln log stack their logs if it's moist enough and it's not windy. That's fine. But they're beautiful. I mean, a lot of people call, you know, the mushroom the fruit, right? So remember the mycelium, the fungi has grown in the log. That's the real body of the fungi, the mushroom. And the mushroom that pops out, that's the fruit. It's like an apple tree, right? It's a whole tree and then it puts out a fruit. What we eat is just the fruit of the fungi. And these are gorgeous. These are shiitakes. Believe it or not, shiitakes make a really good infused vodka. I mean, it sounds weird, but it's delicious. Anyway, in my book, I have a shiitake mushroom cocktail recipe. You'll have to read that. All right. So if you have cut your own logs, do not forget the stumps. So the stumps are an amazing resource for growing your fungi because they have a huge network of roots that is basically wood and cellulose for the fungi to colonize. And it has all the moisture it needs from the ground. So what you would do here is you would drill the sapwood, so you can clearly see that sapwood now compared to the heartwood. And you would drill it and you would go ahead and you'd put your spawn in there and then you would, you know, wax that over. And then, you know, what I'll usually do is I'll cut a slice off and just nail that back on. There's a few variations, really just allowing that moisture to stay trapped. And that successfully runs through the root system. And that can take longer. You know, it could possibly be 2 years until it starts to fruit, but then stumps can fruit for like 10 years or more. So it's really an awesome resource not to overlook. And here's an example. These are oyster mushrooms growing out of an old stump that I found in a parking lot downtown in our Frederick. And I remember that morning I was out, I picked them. I took them to the local cafe and I traded them those for a nice breakfast and coffee. All right, wine cap. This is another one of my favorite mushrooms. It's ingeniously called wine cap. It has that beautiful burgundy top to it. It's also known as garden giant. They can get huge. I mean, like 5 pounds. Mind you, they're better when they're smaller and the caps are not unfurled. That goes for most of your mushrooms. You want to capture them in that harvest period while the cap is still furled. You can still eat them after they've unfurled, but typically they're not as good at that stage. So the wine cap, the Latin for it is Stropharia. It is what we call a terrestrial fungi, meaning that it lives in organic matter, wood chips, straw, you know, mulch, you know, in the landscape. And it's a very opportunistic, very strong growing fungi, so it's easy to work with. Here's a fungi patch, a wine cap patch that I created. The fungi run really quickly through wood chips. And this is another excerpt from my book where I just kind of give a simple recipe. So what you're doing here is you're working with hardwood wood chips. And you want to make sure that they don't have to be as particular as the logs in the sense that they could be a month or two old, even if it's during summer months. And you inoculate with the wine cap, it's likely to go in there and dominate those and kick out any other fungi and still fruit well for you. But ideally, you are using more fresh wood chips because they have nice moisture in them. And if they're not super moist, make sure you're wetting down your wood chips before you go ahead and put in your spawn. Now, in this case, the spawn is sawdust that you would be using to put into the wood chips. And here's an example of retrofitting a tree and growing the wine cap, right? So a lot of trees, unfortunately, are left in a sea of grass, marauding weed whackers and lawn mowers. And what they really want is a fungal environment. So most of our fruit trees and shrubs and woody bushes, they evolved in forest systems that had rich organic matter falling down and creating, you know, that forest floor duff, right? So it's a stress when we take trees out into a grass, you know, landscape, and just expect them to flourish. What they're really needing are fungal networks in the soil all around them. So the more we mulch around our trees, the better. The wider we mulch, the better. So this is a way to come and help rejuvenate some of the neglected trees on our landscape. This is an old apple tree, so I put down fresh cardboard first, and that just kind of creates a barrier between whatever sort of bacteria or other fungi that are in the soil, because I'm going to make a wine cap patch out of this, and I just want to give it a head start. And that kills all the grass. You don't have to remove anything. Just put down cardboard. Then wood chips, you're looking for 6 to 8 inches of wood chips on this. Make sure they're moist. Take your sawdust spawn, sprinkle them in there, and then I like to generously cover it with straw, because straw also is a great food source for the fungi. They'll start to run through the wood chips and into the straw. This patch, if you started it early in the season, you can start wine cap as early as March. You would likely start getting some fruiting mushrooms that fall. Certainly the next year, this ground would just be covered, literally hundreds of wine cap mushrooms running through this whole thing. Now, and then of course you're getting this awesome, fungal rich, compost and soil. And this is fine for the trees. You're not creating an anaerobic condition. You don't really want to pile a bunch of soil around your roots, but this is a sponginess that's only going to increase their oxygen uptake. So if that's a concern, don't worry. So one things I love about this fungi, and I'm imagining why it maybe is called garden giant, is what I'll do in the middle of the summer when my garden plants, my tomatoes, my zucchinis are up and casting some shade. I'll go out to my wine cap patch and I'll take a 5-gallon bucket, and I'll scoop up those wood chips, which are absolutely covered in mycelium. They're spawn now, right? So you really should only ever have to do your wine cap patch once. You should only have to buy it once, because then you can take you can take scoops out of that, start new patches, give them to friends, or take them out to your garden and sprinkle them around your garden vegetables. All right, what will happen, especially if you've got nice organic matter all throughout your garden, is the mycelium will jump off the wood chips and start running through the organic matter on top of your soil and within the soil to a degree, and it'll begin exchanging more nutrients for sugars from the plants. So your plants all of a sudden will get an immune boost. Right? They're going to be healthier. They're going to be more resistant to pest and disease. And you coming out and you're harvesting your tomatoes, your zucchinis, and your mushrooms. So it's like this super win-win symbiotic relationship. Now, our gardens in our landscape in general is always rich in organic matter. Lots of wood chips, lots of straw, lots of ground cover plants everywhere. So the wine cap is actually naturalized on our landscape and comes up all over the place. I even have them growing in full sun because they have constant moisture. So in my swaled gardens, which we're going to talk about in another webinar, I have wine caps coming up in my basins, which are deep and rich in wood chip matter. They're breaking that down and creating more compost in place. It's just phenomenal how beneficial working with fungi in general, but the wine cap has lots of applications. There's a little happy dance with the mushrooms. Actually, here's a picture of a swale many years ago in one of our young food forests where we have the basin and the berm. And what I do is, you can see that white mycelium in there. That's the wine cap I just dug out of one of my patches, and I'm throwing it in my basin with wood chips. And since it's collecting moisture from the rain, it's going to just have the perfect environment. And actually, when you walk on the fungi, you split it and encourage it to fruit. So it's really stacking functions. I'll get more into this when we talk about swales, but I just want to throw this in here now as just a way that the fungi have so many benefits in the extended landscape. Now, as this breaks down these wood chips and turns into compost, I just take that and I throw it on the bed right next door. I'll put down new wood chips and the cycle will continue. You do want to keep up with feeding your wine cap. If you want to keep it growing in the same spot, bring in new wood chips. I would say at least, every 18 months, or at least, I'd say every year to be sure, because they will break down and turn your chips into soil and compost so quickly. And if they do that, they can die out very quickly as well. So keep them fed. As Paul Stamets says, herd your mycelium. And then again, just generously covering that with cardboard straw, trapping moisture. Okay, how much time do I have? Getting excited here because I want to cover these last things. So there's a term called mycoremediation. It's like bioremediation, but mycoremediation is using fungi to help clean up our toxic environments, right? They're amazing at digesting and breaking down chemicals, whether that be oil spills, runoffs from our houses, our roofs, and the mycelium help us break those down and convert them actually into sugars. So what that looks like on sort of the home scale, and what I've done is I take burlap coffee bags, that come from organic coffee, and I'll fill them with wood chips and I'll stick a handful of wine cap spawn in them and I'll let them run through. And look at that spawn. I mean, that's like probably 6-7 weeks during the growing season. I mean, bam, it just goes through that. And that creates a web, right? A very thick web. So now as a filter, when chemicals or oil runoff come through this zone, they hit that filter web and they're broken down and they're converted into sugars, so that you have clean water going past you. Here's a small example. It's my beautiful dog, Chulo. But just over here off screen is a downspout from a house. And just coming down this spot's a creek. So this is typical, unfortunately. Our houses have pretty much, downspouts that run right into our local watershed. And the challenge with that is manyfold, but especially during the summer, roofs heat up. Typically, a lot of chemicals in what they're made with. The rains come down, they pick those chemicals up, they come down the downspout, they run across the grass, which is like green concrete, and runs right into the streams, right? So it's direct pollution. It's very simple to go ahead and interject a small filtration, a little mycoremediation into that zone. So here I've excavated in the lawn, I've put in these sacks. Now, mind you, you do not have to use sacks. I could have just dumped wood chips in here. I didn't even have to inoculate it with wine cap. Ambient fungi would show up. What's going to happen now is that water runs down the downspout, comes and falls into this basin, and it has time to go through the fungi and be filtered before it goes down. You can still mow your lawn perfectly fine. It's really, that'll break down. You just keep adding wood chips. Again, you do not need to be wine cap. Ambient fungi, just fill it full of wood chips and it will begin that filtration process. Very simple. Now you can extend this on a larger scale if you had, say, a pig farm next door, right? And all their effluent was running down across your yard and into the stream. Go ahead and do a large, long swale, put in a bunch of this. And this is a technique that we can very easily adapt for filtering, our environments. And most of our driveways are leaching, oils and who knows what else off of them. We can put in these little filter patches, these little mycoremediation patches, wherever we can capture some of that and filter it and, become stewards for the watershed. Okay, we're not going to get into this, but you can grow, especially oysters, very quickly on sterilized, or I should say pasteurized straw. As quick as 21 days, you can start to get mushrooms. Now, you do have to be a little more particular about the environment they're grown in, but this is also a great way for people who are doing market gardening or need that more, short-term production. You can be quite successful with oysters on straw. This is actually in a shower, an outdoor shower at the Bullitt Brothers Homestead. Some of my favorite permaculturists, Orcas Island, Washington State. Highly recommend if you ever get out there or take some of their courses. They do great permaculture courses, tons to learn from those guys. But this is their shower. They're stacking the function. They're like, okay, well, it's perfect, moisture and humidity, and we can monitor it. It's somewhere you're going and flowing, hopefully. High recommendation to read this book. It is very easy and enjoyable to read. It will blow your mind about all of the different potential functions and uses of fungi. And if it's not realistic that you're going to read a book, check out his 18-minute TED Talk. Paul Stamets' 18-minute TED Talk on mushrooms. I think it's 7 ways mushrooms can save the world. It is amazing. It will just open your universe to how key fungi are and how they're probably our best bet for surviving, current extinction. Okay, that's where you can find me, more information. I actually have quite a bit of this information on my website for free. I do have a big mushroom post with a lot of this information in it. And it's also where you can go and grab my books and see about some of the events we're doing. Yeah.
Okay, so Michael, there were a bunch of questions.
All right.
So let's just go back to the mycelium filtration first. Hannah asked whether you could filter gray water.
Sure. Why not? Gray water is pretty easy to filter. We have a gray water system for our house, gravity fed. And basically it's a shallow trough when we have two raised beds on either side. But really the idea is that you're exposing, the stuff coming out of your gray water to organic matter and fungi to be broken down. So absolutely.
Great. And then I think going back, Jessica was asking, once you've inoculated the wood, how would you stack them? You showed them level, but can you go ahead and stack them?
You can Lincoln log stack them. You saw one picture where I had a couple stacked. If your environment is humid enough and, not being exposed to, winds, that's a very efficient way to do a lot of logs. If you have a lot, I have friends that grow over 1,000 logs and they'll Lincoln log them, 5, 6 high, but they're down in kind of a riparian, sort of a creek floodplain area, which be careful. I've had to chase some logs when I've had floods. Then you can do that. To err on the side of your logs not drying out, I would keep them closer to the ground.
Okay, great. And then I can't remember earlier on when we were talking about the inadvertent sprouting. I think Catherine was asking, the mushrooms that sprouted this spring didn't look like the shiitakes we got last year. Did something else take over? Question.
It's possible, absolutely. And you can ID, knowing what type of mushroom it is. Now, depending on the stage that you're harvesting at. So like last year, you might have gotten them when they were really fresh, and maybe this year you didn't see them until they were more mature. Sometimes, and I've seen this recently on my logs, is we got a little bit of a warm spell and the mushroom started to come out, but then it got cold and it kind of retarded their growth. And then they started getting what looked like stretch marks on them, I think because of that stress, and they didn't grow anymore. And I was like, okay, well, so, that's possible that the weather changing could kind of change the way they look a little bit. So they're not necessarily always going to look the same. There might be some variations. But really with shiitakes and oysters, I tend to find them to be quite obvious for what they are. If you're not sure, don't eat it.
Right. And so I think it's a follow-on to that question. Pam Higgs asks, is there a resource to double check the mushroom before we harvest it?
That's tricky. There are some really good Facebook groups where there's a lot of mycologists that geek out on this stuff, and you could post pictures. and you'd probably get pretty decent feedback. Do not email me any pictures. I do not ID mushrooms for people on purpose, because that's a little dodgy. But you could probably get a lot of good feedback, and I would say check out the Facebook mycology groups for that.
Right. Okay, and Jacqueline and Stephanie are asking how long it takes for the wine caps to fruit.
Well, again, it depends, when you start. If you start early let's say you start in March or April, the beginning of the season, you might start getting some that fall. But then certainly the next, spring, later spring and all the way through. I mean, I except for when it gets really hot in the summer, I see them fruiting. I've had them also fruit, going late into fall. I've had them, fruit, and then there'd be like frosts. That's how cold it gets. So they have a wide window for fruiting. If you start early in the season, you might get some that first, fall. Otherwise, the next year.
Okay, great. And then Glenn is asking, he's worried about all the termites there might be with all the logs. Is that a possibility? Have you ever experienced that?
I've not. They're going through early stage processes of decomposition, so it's not an ideal termite, environment. It's composting. It's warm. It's hot. It's typically the termites are getting into that dry old wood, that might be next to your house. Those kind of conditions that people usually have with old dry wood and termites. I have not had any issues with my, biologically active, in process of composting logs have termite issues.
Okay. And another follow-on couple questions on wine caps. Is it hot? If it's a hot and dry summer, do you have to water the wine cap?
Great question. Yes, I would recommend that. And that goes for the logs as well. So this is a good question I omitted. So once you've placed your logs, now in our environment and where I have my logs, I'm probably not going to worry about them even during a drought because they're just so perfectly positioned. But to be sure, water your logs, water your wood chips. Again, not with municipal water, not with chlorine and all the crap that's in the municipal water, right? Use rainwater or, well water. And soak the logs and the ground around them so that there's that ambient moisture and humidity. And then yes, water your wine cap patches for sure. I put lots of straw on my patches. I'm extra generous with my straw. I'll have 5-6 inches of straw on top of my wine cap patches. And I find that helps enormously with holding the moisture down in the wood chips. And of course, the fungi will come into the straw as well, but just go really thick with your straw. And that can also save you, some worrying about having to water. And, the wine cap does really well under deciduous trees. So that could be under your dogwood, your cherry trees, your ornamental trees as well. They're quite strong. They're more resistant to drying out than a lot of other fungi. But to be on the safe side, yep, water them.
So in the example of the wine caps around the tree, does it need to be entirely in the shade?
I would say initially, probably ideally, again, if you put a really heavy cap of straw on it and it's a typically moist area, you would probably be fine with it. I've been really impressed with the wine cap, doing well with more exposed conditions. But you just can't let those wood chips ever dry out. If they dry out, then it's definitely going to die. But in full sun, if you had a really thick layer over your wood chips, maintaining that moisture, I think they'd probably be fine.
Great. Okay, so Pam asks, would it be okay to seed wine caps now in Maryland?
Yeah, so your window for doing wine caps is really large. You could do them anytime, from spring all the way. I mean, we're like zone 6B, almost 7. I have inoculated wine caps in November, and they've started their spawn run. And of course, there's a phone ringing. they've started their spawn run in that cool weather. They go dormant, right? So they go dormant. Same with the logs. They'll go dormant, and then you don't have to do anything, and they'll wake back up in the spring. And I've had my wine caps do fine, even with that late of a inoculating. So your window, I would say March to November for your wine caps, fine.
Great, great. Okay, so folks, I'm gonna unmute everyone now in case there are any other questions. And then you can go ahead and ask directly. Okay, so you're all unmuted now. Anybody with a remaining question or two?
Oh,
I
hi.
have a
Is there a
question.
recording, going to be
Go
a
ahead.
recording of this?
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, logistics wise, if you missed the first little bit or something, or want to go over a section, yes, we do have it recorded, and I can share that link with you after the.
Oh, you mean at the end of the month?
Sorry, I can't quite hear. But yeah, we'll post it on YouTube.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Anyone else?